This is a conversation with John Dotson, director of the Global Taiwan Initiative, former U.S. Navy officer, and an expert on Taiwanese defense and security policy. There are a lot of discussions on Taiwan and its role in a potential conflict with China, but quite often in these discussions, Taiwan is actually seen as a passive actor. We talk about a potential war between China and the U.S. over Taiwan and overlook what role would Taiwan actually play, even though its role and its decisions would be pretty fundamental. I wanted to explore this in more detail, and so with John, we talk about how Taiwan is preparing for a war with China. Why do people in Taiwan seem a lot less concerned about this than policymakers in the U.S.? Why is Taiwan criticized for not doing enough or for doing the wrong things? Or how likely is it that China could get Taiwan without actually needing to fight for it? This podcast can exist thanks to its supporters on Patreon and Substack, to whom I'm deeply grateful and who get a bunch of perks, including full ad-free episodes and bonus content in return. And if you want to get more geopolitical analysis to help you filter all the noise from the stuff that actually matters, you can sign up to my newsletter, where I break down big picture geopolitical stories, trends, and patterns. You can find the link in the description. And now, enjoy the conversation. So welcome to the podcast.
Oh, hey, thank you very much for having me on your program. It's a pleasure.
So I want to take the advantage of the fact that I have a Taiwan and China expert on the podcast. And I want to talk about Taiwan's defense policies, its military and security preparedness, the threats that it's facing, and the role that the U.S. is playing in that. But I thought that maybe a good way to start would be with a bit of a personal reflection, because we often talk about in the big debate about how Taiwan might face Chinese invasion, how it might be the next big global conflict, flashpoint, how high that risk is. But I was actually in Taiwan about a year and a half ago, and most people that I spoke with, not the people from the government that I had a chance to speak with, but most regular people that I spoke with there, and the overall vibe I got from them was that I'm not sure if the regular Taiwanese really think about those issues that much, or if they feel that level of risk that we talk about. And I often felt like they're a lot less concerned about it than many people outside of Taiwan are. And I wonder if you would say that the majority of people in Taiwan take the threat of war or from China seriously, and maybe what's your experience, and whether you think this is changing.
Sure. I guess to begin answering that question, I might share a personal anecdote or go back in time a little bit. I guess my first exposure to Taiwan was in the mid '90s after I graduated from university with my undergraduate degree in 1994. I had the opportunity to go on a student exchange program and live in Taiwan for 2 years in the city of Taichung. My university, the University of Alabama, had an exchange program with Fengjia University in the city of Taichung. So I went there for a couple of years and was studying Chinese and teaching English. But that period was 1994 to 96, and so the third Taiwan Strait crisis occurred shortly before I left in the autumn of 1996, and I remember at that time thinking how strange it was if you contrasted the international media coverage of it, where there was sort of this very ominous mood, like we could be on the verge of another war, World War III or so forth, and where most people on the street were just kind of going on with their daily lives. I don't know, maybe at the calm eye of the storm, perhaps, and that's always stuck with me. But I think what you described a moment ago, this seeming, this strange, dichotomy, or this strange difference where, it often seems that, people in the, international community, or at least people in the international, community who pay a great deal of attention to geopolitics and foreign affairs, might seem to have a greater sense of concern, for Taiwan's security, than sometimes, Taiwan's own people. Now, of course, it depends a great deal on who exactly you talk to. The typical person on the street who's operating a store, I don't know, operating a food stall in a night market or trying to run a dry cleaning business, whatever. Of course, they tend to be, very focused on their own daily lives, their families, the things like this. Now you will find a higher level of concern amongst people in government or who deal with foreign policy, with cross-strait relations, or so forth. But even there can be sometimes some stark differences in political views as well. Taiwan's politics are very polarized, and that's the case in many countries right now. I'm an American. American politics are extremely polarized right now. And you can often find a significant difference in threat perception, sometimes based on political affiliation, where people who tend to identify with the Kuomintang, the KMT, might have a lower level of threat perception in regards to China, whereas people who might identify as supporters of the Minjindang, the Democratic Progressive Party, might feel a higher level of concern. So that element is there as well. But yes, there can be that issue where it can sometimes seem that many of Taiwan's citizens, again, just kind of trying to get on with their lives, don't seem to pay as much attention to this as sometimes as foreign observers do. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think part of it has legacies that goes back to the martial law era in Taiwan, where there was this very long period from the end of World War II, or at least from the late 40s up until the late 80s, where Taiwan was a one-party state, a one-party dictatorship under the Kuomintang. And there was a very high level of domestic political repression. And I think the lesson a lot of people took from that is, well, just, keep your head down, focus on your business, focus on your family. There are all these other things going on that are sort of out of your control. And just don't concern yourself with it, focus on the things that you can actually affect. I think there's some element of that there as well. I think there's also a certain element of the fact that, people in Taiwan have been living with this threat for so long. And once again, going back in past decades, it was a staple of government propaganda or messaging, again, under the KMT one party state. We have to be ready at all times to fight the communists. We have to be ready to retake the mainland, or to resist the communists if they come. And this propaganda messaging was so heavy for so long. I think a lot of people just kind of ignore it, right? I mean, it became almost a multi-generational impulse to just tune all that out. And I think that element may be there as well. But of course, that phenomenon exists at a time when the threat to Taiwan is genuinely growing. The thought of, the prospect of an invasion by the People's Republic of China, the PRC, was pretty dim in, I don't know, the 70s, going back even into the 80s. But it's a very different situation now. The military capabilities that the PRC possesses, particularly the capabilities for power projection, are leaps and bounds ahead of what they were, 30, 20 years ago. So that threat has grown. And again, even at a time when it may sometimes seem that the man or woman on the street in Taiwan may not pay all that much attention to it. However, I think if you look below that surface impression, there is a growing concern, again, both on the part of people in government, but I think even for, again, the typical man or woman on the street in Taiwan. You can see that how that plays out in Taiwan's politics. for example, where a lot of the debates or arguments between the Kuomintang, the KMT, and the Democratic Progressive Party are often very focused on cross-strait relations or relations with China. And you can also see it in things like discussions over increasing the military budget, the return of conscripted service for young men back up to 1 year. So I mean, that concern kind of is under the surface, and you can see it how it plays itself out in both political debates and policies in Taiwan right now.
The reason that I brought it up, or one of the reasons, was that Taiwan is often criticized quite strongly for not doing enough to prepare for the possible threat. And I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about why is that, and what is the reality, and the details of that. But I guess that if your people don't really think that the threat is there or that it's so strong, it is much harder to put the resources and effort into preparing for it. If I compare it with, for example, to Eastern Europe, to the Baltics or Poland, where even for regular people, I think the threat from or potential Russian invasion is very maybe not an everyday topic, but it's quite visible, and that allows the countries to then put really high resources into defense, for example. And I guess if regular people don't really see the threat that the same way, it makes it hard for the government, even if it wants to maybe prepare for it in a way that would be required.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, I mean, there have certainly been a great many international critics of Taiwan's defense posture, its force structure. I've been one of them. I think thinking of myself as someone who I like to think of myself as a friend of Taiwan, supporter of Taiwan. I wish Taiwan well. I myself have been critical over in regards to many aspects of again, Taiwan's defense strategy, its force structure, and so forth. And I've also been among those who have said that Taiwan does need to be spending more on defense. As you say, I think in Eastern Europe, there is a very clear threat perception that has led to the higher levels of defense spending that we're seeing now. And I think it's a welcome change that NATO countries are now starting to take more serious steps to boost their defense spending, and Taiwan needs to be doing the same. But now there are steps being taken in that direction. But once again, it connects to political debates in Taiwan. As you may be aware, much of Taiwan's the government budget has been held up for much of the past year as part of a dispute between the executive branch, which is controlled by the Democratic Progressive Party, the administration of Lai Ching-te. That's a DPP administration. But the legislature, the Li Fa-yuen, is currently controlled by a majority coalition of the KMT and a smaller party, the Taiwan People's Party. And there have been some pretty serious political disputes between those two sides over some really fundamental things, such as the level of power that the legislature has relative to the executive, to the role of the constitutional court, and there's also been this longstanding dispute over the budget, and that's held up the defense budget for much of the past year. Now, only very recently, within the last 2 weeks, there's been movement for the defense budget to begin moving forward, where it looks like the KMT DPP coalition controlling the legislature finally seemed to relent or back off on that, or taking steps to let it go forward. But that has caused a lot of disruption. But it's also caused a negative perception Certainly, well, I think in policymaking circles in Washington D.C., for example, for people who look at Taiwan and Taiwan China related issues, and once again, do believe that Taiwan needs to be putting more resources towards its own defense. That's not a pretty picture, right? Um, and it does send a message, or it can create a perception that Taiwan just really isn't serious about its own defense. But once again, I think you kind of have to understand the dynamics of Taiwan's domestic politics to kind of like understand how that is playing itself out, and that dispute over the defense budget was part of a larger sort of power struggle between the KMT-controlled legislature and the DPP-controlled executive. But I would say, even stepping back from that, there's also the question of how Taiwan should be using its resources for defense. It's not just a simple question of how many dollars, how many euro, or in this case, how many Taibei, how many new Taiwan dollars that you're putting into the defense budget. It's, what are you spending it on? And I would also argue, there are some ways you can spend that money that are a lot more effective than others. Now, once again, in my own view, just expressing a personal opinion, not speaking for my organization or anything like that, I think there have been some very important lessons that have come out of the war in Ukraine, particularly pertaining to the importance of drones as a tool of modern warfare. And Taiwan has, in recent years, recent decades, has spent very large amounts on buying sort of bigger ticket weapon systems from the United States, whether that be, Abrams tanks or, F-16 fighter jets and so forth. And you can get into a whole complicated set of arguments as to, well, okay, what are these assets actually for? Of what use would they be in an actual conflict? And for that matter, like what use are they in peacetime? Like, how do you employ them in peacetime as a deterrent tool? And I think we may be kind of in a situation now where, as Taiwan's government, Taiwan's body politic, is looking for ways to try to build or maintain closer relations with the second Trump administration. I think that could push them in the direction of, once again, looking for big ticket purchases of defense equipment of the sort that will please U.S. defense contractors, they could please the Trump administration, again, whatever, X billion dollars of a purchase or so forth. But and could go towards some of those, once again, more like big ticket weapon systems, and some of which could indeed be quite useful in the defense of Taiwan in an invasion scenario. But it could also create the problem of, well, are you spending a lot of money on expensive items that might not actually be of that much worth in an actual defense of the island, and might there be other ways in which those resources could be more effectively employed? So yeah, there's a whole complex set of questions they need to consider surrounding the defense budget. Again, not just how much is being spent, but how it is being spent.
Just a quick break here. If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I describe a chaotic oil war that's been going on between the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, that you basically never hear about, but that's quietly shaping geopolitics. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description. And now, back to the conversation. I think maybe to better understand and to contextualize the criticism that you're talking about, if I take a step back and look at sort of the big picture, how well prepared do you think Taiwan is today in terms of defense for a potential conflict with China in your view?
Mm-hmm. Well, once again, I think to answer that question, you almost have to answer like two or three questions. For example, like, what does a conflict with China look like? Something that I've written about is, I think there's often a substantial gap in perceptions, regarding, the threat from the PRC, from China, between like Taipei and Washington D.C. I think if you listen to sort of policy discussions or debates that come out of, again, Washington D.C., for example, they really do tend to focus on the threat of an invasion, like an all-out cross-channel invasion. But on the other hand, I think over the last several years, if you look at either statements that have come from senior officials in Taiwan, or I think in particular, if you look at documents, like official documents that are produced by the Ministry of National Defense in Taiwan, whether that's their quadrennial defense review that they put out every 4 years, or whether it's the annual defense reports that they do, and so forth. You'll see that the things they talk about most consistently as the greatest threats to Taiwan are that they don't talk so much about an all-out, full-bore, we've got 500,000 men loading up on boats and they're coming across the water sort of invasion. Those discussions tend to focus on, what are often termed gray zone operations. These military operations around the periphery of Taiwan that are intended to erode Taiwan's sovereignty and to place psychological pressure on the people of Taiwan, and of what again the Taiwan's Ministry of Defense terms cognitive warfare. This sort of multi-spectrum effort using online propaganda, disinformation, so forth, to try to influence the psychology of the public and sort of like soften the ground for an eventual PRC takeover, or to sort of create a general sense of hopelessness on the part or inevitability on the part of the people of Taiwan, that like China is so powerful. What can we really do? The best thing we can do is just sort of make some sort of a deal and, arrange the best surrender terms that we can. I think from the perspective of, the leaders of the PRC, the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, that's the outcome they want. They want a negotiated surrender, without having to go to war. But anyway, but again, just getting back to my point, you can often find in the discussions about Taiwan's security or Taiwan's defense between Washington and Taipei, there can be this real gap in perceptions where it seems that sometimes people are talking past each other.
Why is that? Why is there such a big threat perception difference?
That's a very good question. And I'm not entirely sure I can answer it. I will say, at least for a partial answer, I think for government officials, defense officials in Taiwan, the thing that they are coping with day in, day out are PRC gray zone operations. And by the way, I mean, that kind of gets into discussions about force structure as well. There's also this argument that goes back and forth. Does Taiwan need a more, in terms of its military capabilities, does it need a more traditional force structure? Does it need fighter aircraft? Does it need Navy ships? Does it need tanks? again, sort of a traditional conventional force structure? Or does it need a force structure and approach that's more asymmetric, which is a word you hear thrown about constantly in in DC policy discussions, anyway. And whatever asymmetric means, that's what it's kind of a vague word that you can almost you can define it 20 different ways. But you hear that coming from the American side all the time. And by the way, it's also a view I tend to share. And I have my own particular ideas as to what asymmetry or an asymmetric approach would mean in this situation. But if you believe that the primary threat to Taiwan is an invasion, like a no kidding, like I said, we're loading up all the divisions of the PLA on boats. We're coming across the water. We're going to put an end to this once and for all. If you believe the primary threat to Taiwan is an all-out invasion, well, then a more asymmetric approach, I think, makes sense. In that case, maybe the F-16 fighter jets don't help you so much. Maybe the Navy ships don't help you so much. They might become missile sponges very quickly. And maybe what you need are a large number of smaller platforms that can shoot a whole lot of missiles. You need things that can sink ships coming across the strait. So maybe you don't need a larger frigate or destroyer. Maybe you need a bunch of little missile boats, for example. Maybe you don't need F-16s. Maybe you need a lot of air defense capability. Like maybe you need a lot of surface-to-air missiles that can shoot down enemy aircraft that are coming at you, and so on and so forth. However, if you see the primary threat in terms of gray zone operations, again, these military aviation flights, naval patrols by the People's Liberation Army, Navy, and so forth, that are moving in closer and closer and closer and closer and closer to Taiwan to constrict its the airspace, the sea space around Taiwan, that constrict the ability of Taiwan's government to sort of exercise effective sovereign control over its own territory. So, well, if you see that as the primary threat, well, then a more conventional force structure then makes more sense. Like, well, okay, if we have a lot of PLA Navy ships that are moving in closer and closer and closer, or Coast Guard ships, the Chinese Coast Guard ships, pressing in closer and closer, maybe we need ships of our own to push back against them, right? If we're primarily concerned with PLA aviation flights coming in close around our airspace, maybe we need our own aircraft to fly patrols to kind of push back on that a little bit, right? So those arguments of force structure do connect to these questions of how do you define what the threat is. Now, once again, I guess getting back to your original question, it's hard to say why that perception is can sometimes seem pretty stark, or it often seems that way to me. Once again, I think for defense officials in Taiwan, that's what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And I think they also correctly understand or identify that as being a part of the Chinese Communist parties, the CCPs, again, what they call cognitive warfare, what I might call political warfare, directed against Taiwan, and understanding that as the primary threat and the area where they need to focus more of their attention. I think policymakers, maybe in the United States, not being so directly exposed to that, and also being concerned about, what would happen if there were an attempt by the PRC to seize control of Taiwan, how the United States might become involved, if this would spark off a war between China and America. And I think inclines perhaps attention more towards the worst case scenario, and of wanting to prevent that, or building up the resources to deter the Chinese from making a move on Taiwan. So, I mean, maybe that explains it. But it is the rest of it. It's actually hard for me to give a really definitive answer on that.
I guess that if you're Taiwan, you kind of do have to prepare for both of the threats that you've highlighted at once, both the big invasion and the gray zone kind of tactics. And if I stick to the invasion, if Taiwan doesn't have the asymmetric approach that you've talked about, what I guess it's the same thing. Sometimes it's called the hedgehog or becoming a hedgehog, turning into a hedgehog. Um,
Or the porcupine defense strategy.
yeah, that's actually not a hedgehog, porcupine. That's the wrong animal. Um,
There's
if,
probably all sorts of animals you could put
yeah,
out.
you can make a lot of metaphors there. What if that's not the official or the mainstream strategy? What is the Taiwanese strategy for that case if they have one? Because, for example, to once again make a parallel with the Baltics, for example, the strategy there is very clear, to mine the border and make it as impenetrable as possible. So and they're quite open about it. Does Taiwan have like a plan or a strategy that they would, you know, publicly put out there of if it happens, worst case scenario, this is what we're gonna do?
Mhm. In terms of a clear strategy that has been made public, not really. But I find it interesting you sort of mentioned the examples of the Baltic states or some of the states of Eastern Europe. Because I would argue that I think Taiwan's sort of overall defense preparedness, its sort of overall defense posture, could learn some important lessons from states like the Baltic states, or perhaps even from Switzerland in terms of having a large, well trained sort of citizen reserve army, and from Israel as well in the same way. Um, and I would argue, in my own view anyway, Taiwan isn't there yet. There are steps being taken in that direction. Um, I guess to try to answer that or discuss that, I might need to rewind a little bit. I think one problem or issue that Taiwan faces is sort of a large gap between uh, sort of mainstream civilian society and the military. And that's something I've encountered a number of times. And the reasons for that are complicated, and I think in part they may go back to once again to the martial law era in Taiwan, where the Republic of China military was very much identified with the KMT as a party. It was a political military, and the Taiwan's military, the army in particular, sort of was used as a tool of domestic political repression. And that has left kind of a bitter legacy in Taiwan society in some ways. But in Taiwan, the military does not enjoy a high social status or a lot of respect. And once again, it's something that has really come through to me as an American, and I'm a military veteran. I was formerly an officer in the U.S. Navy. In fact, I'll share an anecdote that I've shared with a few people over the years. When I lived in Taiwan in the mid '90s, from 1994 to '96, when it was coming up to the end of that time, and I was getting ready to go back to America, I was thinking about doing a few things, but I was thinking very seriously about going into the military, about trying to get an officer's commission and to serve in the military. I had not served in the military previously, but my father had been a career Army officer, so I had some exposure to it in that way. But anyway, so my last 2 or 3 months in Taiwan, as I'm looking at some of these possibilities, and I would be talking with some of the students in the language classes, the conversation classes that I was doing. Yeah, they would ask me, "Hey, John, what do you what do you think you're going to do when you go back to America? And I would mention that as one of the possibilities, like, oh, I'm thinking I might go into the military. The answer I got was usually one of shock and horror. It was like, oh, John, like, no, you don't have to do that. I mean, you're a smart guy. You can get a real job. Why would you want to throw your life away like that? And there was this, and I think still is, sort of almost it might be going too far to say a stigma, but I think there is a view amongst many people in Taiwan society that sort of the military is the place you go if you can't get into the best college, then maybe if you're on that second or third tier, maybe you'll take a scholarship to go to a military academy. There is that perception there. It's very unfortunate, and it's not fair. I do think in Taiwan's military there are a lot of dedicated, smart people who are really concerned for the defense of their state, of their country. But that perception can be there. I've sometimes made the joke that I think what Taiwan's defense really needs is like a series of like cheesy, Top Gun military adventure movies. It's sort of like some dumb movies like this to kind of improve the image of the military or get more young people interested in military service. And that's a problem. And that's not a problem that you quickly fix. That's the sort of problem that takes many years and slowly changing attitudes to fix. But that is one issue that needs to be worked on. Yeah. So I'm sorry, Roy. What was the question you were asking before? Mm-hmm.
Whether if it's not the porcupine strategy, what is the Taiwanese defense strategy for the
Right.
eventuality of a big invasion?
Right. Again, there's a strategy hasn't been clearly articulated. But Taiwan's government is taking some steps in the right direction right now. And I guess the point I was making with the anecdote is that there has been this division between the military and civil society, which needs to be closed, I think. And there are some steps being taken in that direction. The current presidential administration, the Lai administration, has made it sort of a major initiative of what it calls, initiatives for social resilience, and it's created the Olive Society, social resilience mobilization committee to try to coordinate efforts between of civil society groups to support the military in the event of an invasion. And I think that's kind of a slow, halting process, but they are trying. And they're starting to take some steps in that direction. I don't know. For example, something that I've heard in discussions with defense officials or national security officials in Taiwan is steps to try to leverage the logistical capabilities of Taiwan society. It may sound like a joke, but if you've been to Taiwan or spent time there, Taiwan has awesome convenience stores. The 7-Elevens of Taiwan are fantastic, and they're also everywhere. And it's been discussed in the context of the current Hangguang military exercise, like the large military exercise that Taiwan's military does every year in the summer. That they're going to try to incorporate some elements of this into the exercise, including leveraging convenience stores as sort of like logistics centers, just for one example. So I do think it's very important for Taiwan to develop a more effective defense strategy and defense posture. I think these efforts to try to leverage civil society are extremely important. And once again, those efforts have been slow; they've been halting. I'm not sure that the Ministry of Defense or Taiwan's military has the reputation for being a bit insular. and resistant to efforts like this. I think there needs to be a change in institutional culture in that way. Again, I do view these initiatives as being extremely important. Taiwan civil society, I think has, in some ways, has been out ahead of the government in recent years in regards to, well, some things like pushing back against disinformation and CCP directed political warfare. I would actually argue that I think at least in terms of its public efforts, the government has been a bit slow and halting in coming to grips with those, whereas you've seen a lot more movement or energy coming out of civil society organizations, whether that be, Doublethink Labs or the IORG or, Taiwan Fact Check Center, all these NGOs or civil society groups that have popped up to push back against online disinformation and other aspects of PRC political warfare. So as I see it, I think there's a real need to get a tighter lash up or connection between Taiwan's military, between government agencies and civil society. And once again, I think that's a lesson we could take from the war in Ukraine, where elements of the Ukrainian civil society sort of spontaneously jumped up to begin doing things like, fighting back against Russian hackers. Sort of, Ukrainian white hacker groups organizing efforts to push back against Russian hacking efforts and online disinformation and so forth, or engineers who suddenly started making backyard drone factories, or building their own drones in their garage, and sort of a lot of innovative approaches that come out of that energy that civil society can offer. And once again, I think that's a very important lesson that I argue that Taiwan should do more to incorporate into its defense preparations.
I think it's interesting what you say about the distance between military and the rest of the society, because I think that on paper Taiwan has something like 2 million military reservists, but which maybe would suggest that there's a lot of people who went through the military service who are somehow interconnected with the military, who can be called back, and that's quite a significant force. But I guess based on what you're saying, that's probably not really the case in practice.
Taiwan's reserve system is another discussion all on its own. That's been an area in which I've been very critical of Taiwan's Ministry of Defense. Once again, as someone who wishes Taiwan well, and is concerned about their defense, I think that's a real weakness. I would argue, again, just to be kind of blunt about it, for a long time, Taiwan's reserve system has been kind of a joke. Yes, they do have a large number of men, and it is men, really, on paper, who could be called on as reservists for Taiwan's defense. But they don't really have. They're not properly equipped. They're not properly trained. For many years now, the standard practice for reservists in Taiwan is, after a young man did his obligatory conscripted military service, he might have a reserve obligation that would be like for 5 days of refresher training every other year. And you may spend half that time in admin or doing paperwork. There was really very little meaningful training that was done. If you compare it, well, again, I'm a former Navy officer. I was active duty, but then I was also a U.S. Navy Reserve officer. When you're in the United States, when you're a military reservist, you have a duty weekend every month, and then you will have to perform at least 2 weeks of active duty time or training at some point during the year, often the summer, but not necessarily. But you add that all together, you're talking about 24, 40, you're talking about 40 plus days a year in which you are in uniform and in a military environment. And then again, since the 9/11 attacks in 2001, for the last couple decades, we've had extensive U.S. military commitments overseas where reservists often had to be mobilized and perform um, long periods of active duty service, often overseas. So it's much more of a real commitment. But in the case of Taiwan, yes, they have this large reserve force on paper, but the people who are reservists, they never really had to do any meaningful training. They didn't have proper equipment, anything like that. It was almost just sort of a pro forma exercise. So I've been amongst those who've been quite critical of Taiwan's reserve system. Now, over the last few years, we have seen some halting steps in the direction of trying to make Taiwan's reserve forces more effective. There have been some sort of trial or pilot programs to get reservists in for a couple weeks of training. And they've been incorporated more into the Hangguang exercises, for example. But it's still limited and it's not where it needs to be. And particularly when you look at, the conscripted service for young men has always been around, for most of the martial law period, and then going well into the 90s and so forth. It was usually 2 years of obligated service time for young men. That got cut to a year. It got cut down to 4 months, and then it was just a couple years ago that it was bumped back up to a year. But for those who went through the 4 months of conscripted service, I've spoken to young men who went through that, and they almost all describe it as a joke. That it was like summer camp for 4 months. They had us cut grass, do odd jobs. Like, there really wasn't much in the way of real meaningful training. So if you have someone who's a 4-month conscript, if they go through something like that, where again they say, we really didn't do much of anything, I really didn't learn anything, and then you put them into a reserve system where maybe they have 4 or 5 days of training like every other year where they get together, but again, a lot of that is admin time, and then you do a little bit of target practice, and then you're sent home. To what extent is that really preparing you for war or for modern warfare? So a lot needs to be done. Now, once again, some steps are being taken in that direction. But I would argue that those need to be increased, and that needs to be speeded up. Because again, in my view anyway, I think that with the severe threat that Taiwan does face, it's real. I think they need to be looking as a model to countries, once again, like Israel, maybe Switzerland, or some of the Scandinavian Baltic states that do have these much better organized, better equipped, better trained sort of citizen reserve armies. I think that's really key for Taiwan's defense.
Thank you for listening to the free part of this interview. The conversation is not over yet, but the next part is only for the paid members on my Patreon or Substack. I try to make the best possible geopolitics content, and I put a lot of effort and time into this podcast. And there's quite a lot of costs that I have to pay that are associated with it. It's the supporters on Patreon that allow me to do all that, and making part of every single interview exclusively available only for them is my way of saying thank you, since without them, it just wouldn't exist. So if you want to listen to the rest of the interview, ask questions to guests who appear on the show, or myself, get bonus content and my own takes on geopolitics, become part of an active community of geopolitics enthusiasts, and most importantly, make the continued existence of this podcast possible, do consider becoming a supporter. It really helps. To join, you can find the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics.